Great, so I think we're ready to start. Warm welcome to everybody joining us today here at ODI Global and online. My name is Emily Wilkinson. I'm a Principal Research Fellow at ODI Global and Director of the Resilient and Sustainable Islands Initiative, RESI. And it's my great pleasure to be chairing today's event in conversation with Mikko Ollikainen, Head of the Adaptation Fund, and also delighted to have with us Patrick Watt, who is CEO of Christian Aid, who will be moderating the Q&A. Before we get started, just a couple of housekeeping points. Please don't take out any citrus fruit or peel any oranges in the office due to severe allergy of one of our participants. Your cooperation with that is greatly appreciated. Also, we have no scheduled fire drills, so if you hear an alarm, please head back to the lobby and out of the building. Okay, at today's event, we're going to hear about the successes and some potential challenges, perhaps on the horizon for the Adaptation Fund, the interplay between climate change impacts and vulnerability in fragile and conflict-affected settings in particular, as well as current efforts and future plans of the fund to support locally led adaptation, which is really an important feature. A little bit of background: established under the Kyoto Protocol of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, and the Adaptation Fund has, since its launch in 2007, marked a critical milestone in helping developing countries adapt to the harmful effects of climate change and build climate resilience. The fund has so far committed an impressive $1.25 billion to 183 approved projects around the world, about half of which are in LDCs and SIDS. The fund is notable for its relatively straightforward access procedures and its focus on locally led adaptation, particularly in SIDS and LDCs. And it has pioneered direct access and enhanced direct access mechanisms, which enable accredited national implementing entities and regional implementing agencies to directly access finance for their climate adaptation projects. So really a key modality. The fund has established a single country locally led adaptation window of up to $5 million per project program, which is in addition to the $20 million per country. At COP29, the Adaptation Fund was recognised as a key climate fund meriting increased public investment as part of the NCQG, a new collective quantified goal on climate finance, aligning with the broader goal of tripling climate finance to developing countries from $100 billion to $300 billion by 2035. But with a rapidly changing aid landscape and looking ahead to COP30, this is certainly a critical moment to be discussing the wider impacts and future plans of the fund. So with that, let me introduce our distinguished guest, Mikko. Mikko is head of the Adaptation Fund and leads the fund secretariat in Washington, D.C., and brings over 20 years of experience in climate change and environmental issues. Before assuming the current role, he served as lead adaptation expert within the fund, playing a key role in building the Adaptation Fund's portfolio, which currently consists of more than 125 projects and programs. Prior to joining the Adaptation Fund, Mikko worked as a technical specialist at the World Bank, focusing on nature-based climate change, mitigation and forest conservation projects in Africa and Indonesia, and has worked in East and Southeast Asia on global and local environmental and development issues with development finance institutions, academia, and the private sector. Today's discussion will be in two parts. We'll start with a 30-minute conversation. I'll ask a few questions, and then we'll have a Q&A discussion with everyone in the room and online. So please start thinking about questions that you would like to pose. So without further ado, let me start off by asking you, Mikko, what do you think have been the most important lessons to date from the Adaptation Fund's experience in pioneering and scaling up locally led adaptation initiatives?
Thank you very much, Emily, and really a great pleasure to be here. And let me start by thanking you for the excellent introduction of what the Adaptation Fund is and what it does. and apologizing for the late start. It's one of those should have taken the tube moments in one's life. But now we are here and happy to engage with all of you in conversation. It's a difficult time geopolitically at the moment. We were thrilled in November last year when the NCQG decision came out, tripling the target, the annual target, and also that it included a target for tripling the outflows of the funds under the climate convention, including the adaptation fund. Now, this year, as we know, we are in a different reality after only a few months. And 8 budgets, climate finance budgets, are being cut, and we are feeling the impacts of that quite concretely in our work, as I'm sure many of the organizations present here do as well. And with the local-led adaptation, we are working with the people on the ground, with the local communities, households, individuals, and the risk is that with decreasing budgets, those people on the ground with least voice in the international forums will be the ones that will be hit hardest, the ones that will lose out. If there's no climate change adaptation, there will be losses and damages, and if we know that there isn't adequate financing for losses and damages either, so people will have to fend for themselves, and that's of course the worst possible outcome. So it's important and useful to take stock on the lessons that we've learned on local-led adaptation. We are heading towards COP30, that despite the dark clouds on the skies, is expected to be an adaptation COP. Important discussions on the global goal on adaptation, the indicators on how to measure adaptation and so forth. It's important for us to see what's the best possible outcome that we can get to under these challenging circumstances. So we, as the Adaptation Fund, as you mentioned, Emily, we've been established 17 years ago. We've been financing projects for 15 years ago, and essentially since the very beginning, we've been funding local-led adaptation due to the specific setup of the fund and our funding conditions and priorities. And in that, we appreciate the research done by ODI in furthering understanding on local-led adaptation, and of course the very important work on the ground done by organizations like Christian Aid with its hundreds of grassroots partners in developing countries, which are really helpful in building that body of knowledge and understanding on what works in practice. So it's a pleasure to speak to all of you today. Local-led adaptation, as I mentioned, is very much in the DNA of the Adaptation Fund. The local communities often know best how to adapt in their local circumstances. If we involve local communities, we have higher likelihood of achieving sustainable outcomes. People own the activities, and the activities have a better likelihood of being sustainable. And by working with communities, we can manage risks better. The communities also understand the different pitfalls better than outsiders. We also know that there's been a lot of concern and criticism about climate finance from international organizations not reaching the last mile, the people on the ground. And the Adaptation Fund has had that as a focus since the very beginning. We have used since the beginning country systems as much as possible. We were the first climate fund to pioneer something called direct access, which means that countries can have their own agencies accredited to access funds from the international level. This was quite new 15 years ago. Now it's not that new anymore, and there are other organizations doing the same thing. And it really puts into practice the principles of the aid effectiveness agenda, if people still remember that from 20 years ago, of using country systems and being as effective as possible. So currently we have 35 national implementing entities that have achieved accreditation, including ones like Comisión de Acción Social Menonita in Honduras, which is one of Christian Aid's partner organizations, and that champions local-led adaptation there, but many others as well. So we try to keep access modalities simple and quick, and we've received thanks for doing that. And we are also encouraging other funders to do the same. And we are working on streamlining processes so that small governments and organizations in those countries are able to access. So just to say a few words about local-led adaptation, we started, in fact, one of the first projects was in South Africa, where our national implementing partner, the South African National Biodiversity Institute, was discussing with communities on their adaptation priorities. They are often telling the story of how they had gone in and started talking about community-based infrastructure and things like that, improving the roads. But the communities said that, in fact, if we got to choose how we would use money from you, you see that natural nature area up there in the hills that's degraded. If we would have money, we would restore it, because that's the area that we rely on for fresh water. And it came directly from the communities, and these kind of insights prompted the first what we called Enhanced Direct Access program that was funded through Sunbeam South Africa already more than, I'd say, 13 or so years ago. And then there were others in Costa Rica and Federated States of Micronesia and some other countries. So doing this, it really puts in place subnational and local systems. It helps to build the ability to manage finance at the local level. It requires paying attention to having the necessary technical assistance available for the local communities, since they are often quite removed from the central government systems of technical assistance support. And it requires looking at the project management practices, which are also important even at the local level to make sure that the projects are achieve their outcomes. One of the important developments in the area of local-led adaptation are something called the Principles for Local-Led Adaptation that was approved in 2019, and many organizations, it must be several dozen, maybe hundreds of organizations that have nowadays endorsed them, and we as the Adaptation Fund were part of developing those principles, and it was really quite easy for us to do that, because it was exactly what we had been doing, 95% what we had been doing before that anyway. And since that we have taken further steps. You mentioned the single country local-led adaptation window, which is additional to the normal funding that a country can get from the Adaptation Fund. We also have the aggregator window, which means that these are global programs where local organizations from different countries can access funding for community level activities. And we are just going to launch, if our board meeting next week shows us green light, a regional multi-country local-led adaptation window as well. So we are trying to do more, trying to push the envelope, and trying to find ways to make funding even more available for developing countries, and especially for the communities.
Thanks. That's interesting, and I'm sure people have more questions later on around the modalities. But I wanted to pick up on the point that you made around locally led adaptation producing more sustainable outcomes, and sort of dig into that a bit more. Like, what sort of data or sense do you have that this locally led adaptation is achieving more effective outcomes? And in particular, sort of gender responsive approaches, are they yielding the desired effects? Like, what kind of outcome information do you have about those initiatives?
Thank you. We in fact published a report just a couple of years ago on our then portfolio of local-led adaptation projects, which has of course grown a lot since that. But one of the results of that overview of our local-led adaptation projects was that there's a strong correlation between community participation and the sustainability of the results on the ground at the end of the project. This is in line with what we see also in something called ex-post evaluations. So our independent evaluation group, it's independent from us as the Secretariat, they do something called ex-post evaluations, which is looking 3 or 5 years after the end of the project, what's left of the project on the ground, and their results are quite consistent with what I just said, that in cases where there has been a strong community participation in project implementation, project execution, the likelihood is higher for increased sustainability. There are challenges, and how the projects are able to tackle those challenges is also critical in making sure that the results are achieved and are sustainable. Financing projects at the local level requires a specific type of project management or project governance system, so that there's representation of the different elements of the communities, different stakeholders that are relevant for those areas, those communities. It requires that technical assistance that I mentioned, and that's often an overlooked area, and often in short supply as well. And it requires the capacity to manage financial resources, and that has turned out to be a little bit of a bottleneck in some situations where it's taken more time to build in that financial management capacity. There are also challenges related to languages, being able to speak the language of the communities, being able to reach the communities. Our colleagues in the Federated States of Micronesia, for example, talk about the difficulty of traveling to many islands, long distances, and reaching them. Really the solution for this is to keep the procedures as simple and flexible as possible, to involve the existing systems as much as possible, including the local leaders. Of course, there needs to be a critical view to that as well. We don't want to enforce or reinforce existing problems, but when there are functioning systems, we should use those rather than reinventing wheels. It's important that, especially when these local-led adaptation projects are supervised by national organizations rather than international organizations, that helps to build in the capacity in those national level organizations. And we've seen that is very conducive for replication and scaling up of those activities, so that, which is of course something that we want to see and that we need to see in countries around the world, to not only do these projects that the Adaptation Fund can fund, but to have all available stakeholders, all available funders to step in and do that as well. You mentioned gender. That's perhaps an area where we also need to be mindful of not reinforcing issues that have pre-existed, and that we need to actively push for a more informed approach on taking gender into account. We are constantly revising our gender policy. That's been now there for 10 years, and we've revised it a couple of times. And really for us, I mean, it's a dual goal, and I think it needs to be said that for the Adaptation Fund, good management of gender issues is not only about our commitments to the UN declarations and commitments related to gender equality, but it's also about effective adaptation. If we disregard half of the population or their specific needs, we are not really being as efficient and effective in our adaptation actions as we need to be. And of course, this is the picture is even more nuanced than that, but perhaps. So we've been the first climate fund to develop a gender scorecard that is actually measuring our performance in terms of the implementation of the gender policy, and we are getting some quite interesting insights on how the portfolio is faring, what are some of the difficult areas that we need to work on, and so forth. So it continues to be a learning and improvement process.
Thank you. I'll ask maybe one more question before we go to sort of Q&A. I'm wondering, and this is the sort of question we've been asking all of the climate funds recently, how are you pursuing or looking at complementarity and key strategic partnerships with other climate funds and with other funding agencies, particularly given the sort of shifting aid landscape that we're currently experiencing? What are priorities for you in relation to those sort of partnerships?
Yes, that's a very good question at this time in particular. We have been building a very functioning partnership with the other climate funds, with the operating entities of the financial mechanism of the Climate Convention. We've been doing that with some of the funds. We are, in fact, neighbors with the Global Environment Facility, and that makes it easier. We've been working with the Green Climate Fund for almost 10 years on areas like scaling up our projects with the larger resources that are available from the GCF, on streamlining and harmonizing our processes and policies. For example, this process of accrediting organizations, national or regional or international, there's no clear reason why those should be separate processes in the Adaptation Fund and the GCF, and we've done a streamlined fast-track accreditation process between the two funds that's reciprocal. We also look at things like readiness to access climate finance together. We have a very active community of practice of these direct access entities, the national organizations that have achieved accreditation to receive resources, and we support them together. I mean, all of these funds, they have their different mandates as well. The Adaptation Fund is very good. I mean, I don't want to brag, but we are very good in what we are doing. The other funds are very good in doing something else. The GCF is very good in doing projects at the level of hundreds of millions of dollars, which is outside of our current scope. There's the new fund, the Fund for Responding to Loss and Damage, which is just starting, but we have very good collaboration and exchange with Ibrahima, the executive director of that fund. And really what we try to achieve is avoiding sort of competition, and instead achieving complementarity between the different funds so that we can build on our respective strengths and to do things together. And that's indeed what we are doing with all of these funds. But just to add, we shouldn't only look at the climate funds under the convention or climate funds only. We should consider all the other organizations and funders that are working on climate change adaptation, and the list is long already, and it's growing, which is great. It's been really encouraging to see organizations, for example, in the humanitarian sector, to really integrate adaptation in their work. Organizations like Christian Aid as well. And now I think the key question will be how to best coordinate all of these actions. The countries are often a little bit bewildered by this number of organizations, and they face challenges with having a coherent approach and not get overwhelmed by the amount of organizations. But I think we are making some really good progress in helping countries also coordinate how they use the funding from different sources to meet their climate change needs.
Great, thank you very much. I'm going to hand over to Patrick now, from CEO of Christian Aid, to moderate the Q&A, but also if you wanted to comment on your interactions with the Adaptation Fund, feel free to do so.
Thanks. So yes, maybe while I say a few words, start thinking about the questions you want to ask. I believe we've also got some people following this online. So, already I've got an anonymous question that's popped up on the iPad, so I'll come to it in a moment. I mean, maybe just to say, affirming what Mikko has said, I think our experience has been that the Adaptation Fund has been a very easy and positive interlocutor, without turning this into a competition, easier and more positive than some other bits of the global climate finance architecture. And perhaps it is partly to do with the kind of intermediate scale at which you support a lot of the work that you do support. And I think, from a kind of Christian Aid point of view, we are, working with national civil society for the most part, a relatively kind of modest scale. And really what the Adaptation Fund enables us to do potentially through organisations like the Mennonite Social Action Commission in Honduras is to start to scale and sustain some of that demonstration effect programming that we're able to do with our own finite voluntary resources. So I think it's been a very positive collaboration. I think everything you're saying about the kind of challenges with the current aid climate really resonates, and I think the increasing risk of cannibalisation, different bits of the climate finance and development finance pots only increasing at the moment. So with that, so an initial question, maybe they're all anonymous, they're all headed anonymous. So asking if you could paint a picture of the adaptation funding landscape. I think you started to do some of this already, but specifically with relation to sources of funding available in global south countries. So which funds and organisations do you work with, including in fragile and conflict-affected contexts?
Thank you. Should I answer that question?
Please, do you want to go ahead?
Sure. Thank you, Anonymous Online, for the question. It's a very good question and not very easy to answer. So I'll give a general answer, but I'll be happy to engage in more specific discussion on it afterwards. The climate funds under the convention are actually just a small part of the available funding for adaptation for developing countries. We are a few percentage points of the full available funding, but most of the funding comes from elsewhere. The multilateral development banks, for example, they are one of some of the larger scale funders at the moment. They've started tracking their investments a few years ago. in terms of its impact on climate change mitigation and climate change adaptation. And based on their figures, they are probably one of the largest groups. Bilateral donors, such as the FCDO from the UK and others, are important. United Nations organizations, humanitarian organizations, NGOs, large NGOs, and increasingly countries own funding agencies. We see national development banks from countries starting to appear as major players in the adaptation field. Philanthropies, both from the global south and from the global north, are important. And what am I missing? Well, I mean, as you can see, it's a very diverse landscape, and there are assessments of and analyses of which groups of organizations fund how much. Notably, one of the important groups that's missing at the moment is the private sector. So until now, it's been really challenging to find ways in which the private sector could engage in climate change adaptation, and we hope that there will be a change to that. But maybe I'll just leave that there.
Great. So I've got a couple more questions that are coming online, and then I'll open it up to the room. So one is from Clara Gallagher at IIED, and she's asking, with the new regional approach, what's been learned from Green Climate Fund's multi-country projects to anchor the projects not only with country ownership but also inclusive of the LLA principles? And what are the practical differences you're looking to build into the Adaptation Fund's regional LLA approach? And how does a project manager handle the kind of multiplicity of different approaches likely to be needed to achieve the same end in different contexts? Have you caught that?
Yes. Thank you for the question. Thank you, Clara, for that. So we're just at the point of presenting the concept of regional local-led adaptation programs to our board next week, and it's been informed by the work done by other funds such as the GCF, but also the work that we've done. We've had regional projects that have had strong local-led adaptation elements to them. I guess one of the key challenges that is evident is that when you do things in a multi-country way, you try to coordinate activities at the community level between countries. You have a lot of different kinds of challenges in achieving that coordination, given that you are crossing national boundaries, sometimes linguistic boundaries, and different political realities that countries, even in the same region, address their adaptation challenges. So I think there are plenty of challenges that need to be overcome when we work between countries, especially when we work at the communities in different countries. But I would say that the potential benefits really outweigh those challenges, because everyone working in climate change adaptation, we are very much in a learning mindset, and not only we are learning about what works best in the current climate change situation, but climate change itself is progressing, and we are seeing different and larger climate impacts on the ground that we need to adapt to. So having that learning done across regions is really powerful, and that's what we hope to achieve with this regional program.
Great. There are a couple more online, but I'll just check whether there's anybody here in the room who would like to ask a question. Got a hand raised in the front here. So I'll perhaps take a cluster. I've got three hands, and I'll come to you a bit later. Do you want to start?
Great. Oh, Thank you very much. Hi, I'm Josephine, and I work at Invesco. So, to your point, a very different part of the traditional financial ecosystem, but we're exploring the world of adaptation, impact investing. And so, as you mentioned, it's been challenging to get the private sector involved to date. I'm curious about your advice on the how, not the need to, but the how. To further blended finance and its effectiveness in solving these challenges, particularly in this current environment with the foreign aid spending shifts. So yeah, do we need to increase ratios? Yeah.
Great. And Mikko, if you're happy, we'll take kind of
Sure.
a cluster. So I think Mariana next. And then
Hi, Mariana Pali with Christian Aid. I actually have two questions for you. The first one is that a number of civil society organizations have been targeting the UK government to actually start contributing to the adaptation fund. And given, as you said, locally led adaptation so much in the heart of what the adaptation fund is doing, it's also a common agenda for the UK government, as well as the work on fragile states. Do you think there's some common ground to move that agenda forward with the UK? And the second one, given that adaptation is so important for COP30, and you know, we're talking about the GGA, do you see a room for sub-goals on adaptation in the roadmap from Baku to Berlin, and especially with targets of grants-based finance at scale, which is actually what's mostly needed for adaptation? Thank you.
And then one more question here.
Thanks very much. My name is Michael. I work for Give Directly. We're an NGO who provide cash transfers to people who are in extreme poverty, including those who are affected by the climate crisis. It was great to hear so clearly and repeatedly your emphasis on locally led adaptation and making sure the voices from the communities affected by the climate crisis aren't marginalised more than they already are in the current climate. We'd be really interested in your views on how more adaptation finance can be channeled directly to communities and to individuals going forward, and what innovations you're either exploring yourself as the fund, or you think should be explored more broadly by the big climate community that exists out there. Thanks.
Great.
Happy to take those.
Okay, well, thank you. Wow, very different and questions, but I like the scope of questions that we are having. Josephine, your question about impact investment. It's a new area, and I shouldn't say too much based on the adaptation fund experience, because our way of working is different. We work providing funding directly to the local communities, whereas in impact investment you would need to make the case for investors on why they would support adaptation. And I guess the question is, what are the important factors that appeal to the impact investors? What do they want to see as the outcome of the investment? And I guess there's diversity there among investors as well on what they would prioritize. I think there have been interesting examples in other areas of impact investments in relation to, let's say, nature conservation, biodiversity, that you're probably looking into as a sort of potential models, and which part of that could be applicable to adaptation finance as well. Yeah, probably from this on, I would be speculating too much, so I'll leave it here. But it's a really good question. I'm really happy to hear that you're working on it. Mariana, thank you for your question on the what's going on in the UK, and of course.
You've just been to FCDO today.
We met with FCDO yesterday.
Oh, yesterday.
Yes, and I guess I'm not saying too much by saying that the UK government seems to be currently still making sense of how to interpret these overall announcement by the Prime Minister earlier this year to practice and what it would mean. And our discussion was around that topic. But we of course appreciate always when civil society organizations put in a good word for organizations like the Adaptation Fund. So thank you for doing that. Towards COP30, it is a challenging situation. Of course, we want to see a COP that delivers a good outcome. There are many parties and many stakeholders in the negotiation process that would like to see an outcome for finance, and especially for adaptation finance, and linked to the global goal on adaptation process. There are others who are a bit nervous about that kind of discussions at the moment, because the financial reality that we are in at the moment. And it's something that we are thinking about very much at the moment, how to continue progress in a way that is realistic and possible in the current macroeconomic and geopolitical reality. I hope that the current situation is temporary, and that in let's say a year or two, that things would be again more conducive for returning to the types of discussions that we had in Baku, for example, when the tripling target was agreed. But the future is unknown, unfortunately, in relation to that. But we'll be happy to continue the discussion on that, and we are in discussion with the COP30 presidency as well on what could be the potential ways that we could add value to that important conference in November. And Michael, your question about scaling up the support to communities, that is really a big and challenging question, because we all agree that more finance would need to be channeled to communities. Then again, when we are working with taxpayer resources, like we are mostly with the Adaptation Fund, there's a lot of attention on the fiduciary control, so that even if the funding goes to the local level, that it's not misspent, mismanaged, that funding doesn't go to corruption and so on. And that's a kind of concern that needs to be, so the balance needs to be struck between ability to deliver on the ground to the communities and the necessity to maintain controls on the and oversight rather on the financial management. That's there's no rule set in stone, and as the climate crisis is progressing, my view is that we should look into more into the delivery and not be so hung up on the looking at the rules. In the Adaptation Fund, we haven't had any cases of corruption in our national implementing entity implemented projects. Our standards are decidedly high, but as we know that we could deliver so much if we would make things more flexible, it's a continuous balance that we need to strike. On how to make things more, and perhaps Christian Aid would have also important views on, since you work directly with the local organizations and communities. One of the things I would say is that since we are running against the time with the climate crisis, it's important to use whenever possible existing delivery mechanisms, existing channels. Developing countries are at very different levels in that regard. Some countries have, for example, Indonesia, where I used to work earlier, has the statewide program that goes all the way to the communities, to the villages, that they have used to fund development activities, and it's possible to repurpose programs like that to work with work on adaptation, and many other countries have similar existing models. So that's something I would say, if we want to scale up, let's first look at what's out there and use those systems.
Great. Just looking at the time, have we got a hard stop at 1?
Yes.
We have, right. So I'll try and cluster. There are 3 questions on here on the tablet, and then I'll come.
My question's asked.
It's already been asked. Thank you. So I hope I'm not mispronouncing your name, Gundula Löffler from ODI Global. Kind of question about local subnational government, local municipal government. Do you see local municipal governments supporting or leading requests for funding, and any specific challenges that might be keeping them from making those requests? And then a couple of other questions, kind of funding related, one from Sarah Knight. How is the Adaptation Fund looking to fill the gaps left by bilateral aid cuts? I think you started talking about that a little bit. And perhaps on a related point, how do NGOs who aren't currently tapping into Adaptation funding, how can they be better positioned to access that funding and ensure that locally adaptation is made available to areas commonly bypassed by adaptation funding, particularly conflict-affected, fragile contexts? And then a question from UN Foundation about what can advocates do to better support the work of the Adaptation Fund, particularly your innovations in locally led adaptation, and reaching the goal of tripling outflows, which, for all the reasons you've said already, is going to be very challenging. That probably is enough to take us to 1 o'clock. I think you've got about 90 seconds.
Okay. Thank you so much. And I need some seconds to think about the answers to these questions. But no, it's very, very good. Local municipal governments, they're really important. Overall, local governments are coming in force to climate change adaptation at different levels, from cities to local rural governments, and it's important to continue working with them. They have the same types of challenges as governments and same types of challenges as local communities, and I've talked about those. We'd really like to see more, and we do work with local municipal governments, but we'd like to see more of them working with us. Bilateral aid cuts, we are available for the organizations that otherwise would have worked with the bilateral funding. We have plenty of funding windows that are related to local-led adaptation. I didn't mention our funding windows, the regular funding windows for just all kinds of adaptation projects, our innovation funding, and so on. I would encourage organizations that find themselves in that situation to look at what's available. We work through implementing entities, so in some cases it would be project directly with an implementing entity. In other cases, it could be one of these aggregator programs that then cater to a number of smaller projects at the same time. And again, we'll be happy to share more information on how that works. The question from UN Foundation, it was about advocacy.
Yes, it was about advocacy and what can advocacy organisations do to support efforts to triple adaptation funding given the current
That's
context?
easy. That's easy. Well, it's 2 things. It's noise, just keeping it on the agenda, and solutions. I mean, if there are ways to find areas in which there can be win-wins between the scarcer resources that are available and priorities in different areas. So I would just leave that.
Yeah, and I think that's a good kind of call to action for us, make some noise and come up with some solutions. So we've got some homework to take away from this meeting. But thank you very much, Mikko.
Thank you very much, and thank you, everyone.
Thank you.